The Empress Dowager's question came at the worst possible moment, while Thessara was trying to keep a dying man's blood inside his body. "Tell me again," the old woman said from the far side of the medical tent, her voice threaded with the particular impatience of someone who had ruled 3 systems and now found retirement intolerable. "Tell me about the human." Thessara's hands did not stop. She pressed the coagulant pad harder against the wound, a shrapnel laceration across the left flank of a Valorian dockworker who had been standing too close to a fuel cell when the bombardment resumed. The pad was already saturated. She needed a second one, and the supply crate was 6 steps behind her, and her hands could not leave the wound. "Grandmother," she said, keeping her voice level, "this is not the time." "It is exactly the time. You have been queen of the Valorian sovereignty for 9 years, and in those 9 years you have told me about trade disputes, fleet deployments, colonial charters, judicial reforms, and the particular shade of gray your council chamber turns during the winter solstice. You have never once told me about the human. I am 87 years old. My patience for your evasions expired roughly a decade ago. I am trying to save this man's life." "Then talk while you work. You were always better when your hands were busy." Thessara felt the familiar tightness behind her sternum, the one that arrived whenever the subject surfaced, pressing against her ribs like a door she had braced shut and could feel someone leaning on from the other side. She glanced at the dockworker's face, unconscious. His vitals on the portable monitor were stabilizing, but slowly. The coagulant was doing its work. She needed time and pressure and one more pad. "Relin," she called over her shoulder. A young field medic appeared at the tent flap, wide-eyed, exhausted, her pale lavender skin smudged with ash from the latest strike. "Second coagulant pad, top shelf of the supply crate, and check the triage queue. How many are we holding?" 14, Your Majesty." 3 critical. "Move the criticals to tent 6. Dr. Veshan has capacity." Relin vanished. The Empress Dowager, seated on a supply crate with a thermal blanket wrapped around her thin shoulders, watched Thessara with eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes, deep amber, still fierce at 87, had negotiated the sovereignty through 2 wars and a famine. They had also, apparently, decided that a field hospital during an orbital bombardment was an appropriate venue for the conversation Thessara had been avoiding for 9 years. "His name," the old woman said. Thessara closed her eyes for one breath. When she opened them, the dockworker's bleeding had slowed to a seep. "Corin," she said. "His name was Corin Vale." His name is Corin Vale. He is alive." "As far as I know." "As far as you know." The Empress Dowager's tone carried the exact weight of a woman who had raised 3 daughters and buried 2 husbands and understood precisely when someone was lying to themselves. "Continue." Thessara accepted the fresh coagulant pad from Relin, applied it, and began the story she had never told anyone. Not her council, not her war minister, not the succession advisors who had spent years presenting her with diplomatic marriage candidates and watching her reject everyone with the same quiet, implacable refusal. She told it the way she had lived it, starting from the middle, because the middle was where everything had fractured. The refugee transit station on Kalos IV had been a warehouse before the war. It still smelled like one, machine oil and packing foam, and the metallic bite of recycled air pushed through filters that had not been changed in months. Thessara had arrived there 12 days after the fall of the Valorian capital, wearing borrowed clothes, carrying no identification, her left arm immobilized in a field splint that a retreating medic had applied with shaking hands before disappearing into the exodus. She was not supposed to be alive. The palace evacuation protocol had been triggered when the Carthene fleet broke through the orbital defense grid, and the protocol was specific. The Queen boards the sovereign shuttle, the shuttle exits through the polar corridor, the escort fleet covers the withdrawal. Clean, practiced, rehearsed annually. What the protocol had not anticipated was a direct strike on the shuttle hangar 30 seconds before boarding. The blast had killed 11 members of her personal guard, collapsed the hangar's eastern wall, and thrown Thessara 40 feet across a loading bay into a stack of cargo containers. She had regained consciousness alone, her arm broken, her communication implant shattered, the hangar burning around her. No guards, no shuttle, no royal identification. The biometric seal on her wrist had been damaged in the blast, its crystalline surface cracked into a web of dead circuitry. She was a Valorian woman in borrowed clothes with a broken arm and no way to prove she was anyone other than another refugee fleeing the capital. She had walked out through the service tunnels, 7 hours through maintenance corridors that she knew from the architectural surveys she had studied during her first year as queen, not because she expected to crawl through them, but because Thessara believed a sovereign should know the bones of her own palace. The tunnels led to a drainage outfall on the city's southern edge, and the outfall opened onto a road clogged with refugees moving south toward the transit ports. She had joined them, a queen among her own displaced people, indistinguishable from any of them, walking on a road that her government had built and her military had failed to defend. The transit station on Kalos IV was where the road ended. Valorian refugees were processed by species, logged by name, assigned cots in a converted warehouse bay, and told to wait. Wait for relocation, wait for news, wait for someone with authority to decide what happened next. Thessara had given a false name, Thessa Valen, a textile worker from the capital's manufacturing district. The processing clerk had not questioned it. She looked like every other refugee, exhausted, injured, carrying nothing. The cot they assigned her was in Bay 7. 400 cots arranged in rows, separated by hanging sheets that provided the illusion of privacy and none of the reality. The air was thick with the sound of people trying to sleep in a space designed for cargo, coughing, murmuring, the thin crying of children who understood the displacement even when they could not name it. Thessara lay on her cot and stared at the corrugated ceiling and calculated. Her council would have activated the succession contingency within hours of the palace strike. Vice-Chancellor Dorath would assume the regency. The fleet remnants would regroup at the Tessarine staging point. The machinery of government would continue because she had built it to continue without her, not because she anticipated her own death, but because a queen who designs a system that cannot survive her absence has designed a monument, not a government. The calculation was clean. The machinery would hold. What the calculation did not account for was the weight of irrelevance. She had spent 7 years as queen, every hour structured, every decision consequential, every word a policy position that affected millions. And now she lay on a refugee cot, her broken arm throbbing, her identity dissolved, and she was no one. The absence of purpose pressed against her like a physical thing, heavier than the pain, heavier than the fear. She stayed 3 days before the human arrived. 3 days of warehouse ceiling and hanging sheets, and the sound of 400 people breathing in a space that smelled like displacement. 3 days during which a Valorian grandmother 2 cots over recognized Thessara's speech patterns, the formal cadence, the precise diction, and asked if she had worked in government service. Thessara said she had been a clerk. The grandmother nodded and said, "You hold your spine like my daughter. She served in the palace." The irony was so exact it felt surgical. Thessara turned her face to the sheet and bit her lip until the urge to laugh or weep passed, because in a refugee bay, both sounds carried, and neither could be explained. On the second day, a dispute erupted in Bay 5, 2 families claiming the same cot, their voices rising to the particular pitch that exhaustion and fear produce when they converge. The Kalosian station staff were slow to respond. The night shift was undermanned, and the dispute was not violent, merely loud. Thessara lay on her cot and listened and felt the pull, the sovereign's reflex to intervene, to adjudicate, to apply the framework she had spent 7 years constructing for exactly this kind of conflict. But she was not the queen here. She was Thessa Valen, textile worker, injured arm, no authority. She lay still and let the dispute burn itself out, and the helplessness was a kind of pain she had not prepared for, not the pain of being unable, but the pain of being unwilling to reveal the ability. He came in with a supply convoy, a battered ground transport carrying medical kits, water purification tablets, protein ration blocks, and a single human male who stepped out of the cab, surveyed the transit station with the unhurried assessment of someone who had seen worse, and began unloading crates. Corin Vale, she learned his name later. In that first moment, she learned only what he showed. Early 30s, dark hair cut functional rather than fashionable, a face that had been weathered by something harder than age, sun, wind, work, the particular erosion that comes from spending years in places where comfort was not on the inventory. He wore a plain utility jacket over a gray shirt, heavy boots scuffed to the color of dust, no insignia, no rank markers. He moved crates with the efficiency of a man who understood that every minute a supply pallet sat on a transport was a minute someone in the station went without. He did not greet anyone. He did not announce his purpose or distribute business cards or engage in the performative introductions that humanitarian workers from more organized agencies seemed to require before they could begin the actual work. He simply moved, crate to dolly, dolly to depot, depot to shelf. His back was straight but not rigid, the posture of someone who had carried heavy things for long enough that the carrying had become architecture rather than effort. She watched him from her cot. She had positioned herself near the bay entrance, a habit from her palace days, when she had always chosen the seat with the best sightlines. From there she could see the processing area, the supply depot entrance, and the human who moved differently from every other aid worker in the station. The others worked with the focused competence of professionals performing a function. Corin Vale worked with something else, a quality Thessara could not name until the second day, when she watched him kneel beside a Valorian child in Bay 3. The child was perhaps 4 years old, female, alone, separated from her family during the evacuation, logged into the system as an unaccompanied minor, assigned a cot and a ration card and nothing else. She had not spoken since arriving. The social workers had noted her silence in the file and moved on, because there were 400 people in Bay 7 alone, and the mathematics of crisis did not allow for extended attention to a single quiet child. Corin Vale knelt beside her cot. He did not speak to her in Valorian. He did not have the language beyond a few functional phrases. He did not pick her up or touch her or make the performative gestures of comfort that adults often inflict on frightened children. He sat on the floor beside her cot, cross-legged, and pulled from his jacket pocket a piece of folded paper. Slowly, deliberately, he began folding it into a shape. Thessara watched from 20 feet away. The paper became a small winged creature, not any species she recognized, something from the human's own world. An animal with spread wings and a triangular body and a tail that he pinched into a fan. He set it on the edge of the child's cot and waited. The child stared at it. Her dark eyes, Valorian deep violet, large and liquid, tracked the paper shape. After a long moment, her hand moved from beneath her blanket and touched one of the wings. The wing bent under her finger, then sprang back. The child's mouth moved. Not a word. Something closer to the beginning of a word, the faint, preliminary motion of a voice remembering how to work. Corin reached into his pocket and produced another piece of paper. He began folding a second shape. This one took longer, more folds, more precision. When he finished, he set it beside the first. 2 paper creatures, side by side, on a refugee cot in a converted warehouse, and a 4-year-old girl who had not spoken in days touched the second one and made a sound that was almost the ghost of a laugh. Thessara's vision blurred. She turned her face toward the hanging sheet beside her cot and breathed until the pressure behind her eyes subsided, and she understood what she had not been able to name, the quality that made the human different. It was not compassion. Compassion was common enough the transit station ran on it. It was attention. Specific, patient, unhurried attention directed at a single person, offered without agenda or expectation, costing nothing but time and a piece of folded paper. The kind of attention that said, "I see you." Not the category of you, not unaccompanied minor, Bay 3, file number 7741. But you, the small person on this cot who has lost everything and needs someone to sit on the floor and make something with wings. It was the kind of attention Thesara had spent 7 years as queen trying to institutionalize through policy. And here it was, living in a human's jacket pocket, requiring no legislation at all. She watched him for days. She watched him distribute rations in Bay 7 with a system he had apparently devised himself. The elderly and the injured first, then families with children, then singles. He did not announce the system. He simply began at one end and worked through, and by the third distribution, the refugees had adopted it without being told, forming a line that organized itself around his quiet architecture. She watched him repair a water purification unit that had failed in Bay 4, not because it was his job, but because the Kalosian maintenance team was overwhelmed, and the refugees needed clean water more than they needed jurisdictional clarity. He worked on it for 6 hours, lying on his back under the unit, his hands blackened with mineral deposits, asking questions of a Kalosian technician in a pidgin of 3 languages that should not have been functional but somehow was. She watched him sit with a dying Velorian man on the 4th night, an older male, a factory supervisor from the capital's industrial quarter, whose injuries had been triaged as non-survivable. The medical team had made him comfortable and moved on. Corin sat beside his cot from midnight until dawn, not speaking, not offering false comfort, simply present, a witness to the passage of a life that the machinery of crisis had already categorized as lost. The man died at 4:37. Corin closed his eyes, noted the time on a pad he carried, and covered the man's face with the sheet. Then he went to the supply depot and began unloading the morning's delivery. The factory supervisor's name was Volunteerk. Thesara learned it from the social worker's log the following morning, when the cot was stripped and reassigned. Volunteerk, age 57, industrial sector, 2 dependents, a wife and a son, both processed through a different transit station, both unaware that his injuries had been upgraded from survivable to fatal in the 12 hours since they were separated. The log noted the time of death and the name of the attending medical volunteer. It did not note that a human had sat beside him through the last 6 hours of his life, so that Volunteerk's final experience of the universe would include the presence of another conscious being who believed his last hours warranted company. Thesara added Volunteerk's name to the list she was keeping in her head, the list of names she would carry when she returned to the throne, because she would return. She was beginning to understand that. The irrelevance she had felt on the first day was not permanent. It was the shock of severance, the phantom limb sensation of a woman separated from her function. The function would return. The name she gathered here would go with it. On the 5th day, Thesara's field splint failed. The binding loosened during sleep, and when she woke her arm had swollen to twice its normal size, the fracture site hot and rigid under the darkened skin. She sat on her cot and breathed through it and assessed her options. Treatment required registration, and registration required identification, and her biometric seal was dead, and her false name would not survive a medical database cross-reference. She was still calculating when the human appeared at the edge of the hanging sheet, a medical kit in his left hand. "Your splint shifted. I noticed it yesterday. Can I look?" "I am fine." "Your arm is twice its normal size and you have not moved from your cot in 4 hours. You are not fine." No judgment, no soft condescension. A fact, offered because the fact was relevant. "I do not require assistance." He studied her. She felt his gaze move across her face with the same unhurried attention he had given the child and the dying man and the water purification unit. His eyes were gray-green, steady, the color of ocean water over stone. "You're afraid of the medical tent," he said. "You have been avoiding it since you arrived. You registered under a false name. You positioned your cot at the bay entrance for the sightlines, which is a tactical choice, not a comfort choice. And you watch everything in this station the way someone watches who is used to being responsible for what they see." The air left her lungs. "I do not know who you are," he said, "and I am not asking, but I know field medicine. I can reset that splint and reduce the swelling without a medical database entry, if you want." She looked at his hands, calloused, scarred across the knuckles, blackened under the nails from mineral deposits. Working hands, hands that had folded paper birds and closed dead men's eyes and repaired water purifiers and unloaded supply crates. Hands that did not belong to a man who asked for anything in return. "Yes," she said. He knelt beside her cot and worked quickly but carefully, removing the failed splint, examining the fracture with fingers that were gentle the way competence is gentle. He realigned the binding, applied a fresh compression wrap from his kit, secured it with adhesive strips, and packed a cold compress around the swelling. "The fracture is clean," he said. "No displacement. Keep the compress on for 2 hours, then let the arm breathe. I will bring a fresh wrap in the morning." "Thank you." He began packing his kit. Then he paused, without looking up. "The little girl in Bay 3, Naya, she spoke today. Her first word in 6 days. What did she say?" "She asked for more paper." Something cracked in Thesara's chest, not the sharp fracture of grief or shock, but a slower giving way, like ice on a river in early spring, splitting along lines that had been forming for days. She turned her face away and breathed, and when she turned back, the human was watching her with an expression she had never seen directed at her by anyone who did not know she was the queen. It was respect, not deference, not the calculated performance of admiration that courtiers offered to power. Respect, the kind that one person extends to another when they recognize something that has nothing to do with title or rank. "You carry yourself," he said quietly, "like someone who is used to carrying other people." The words landed in the center of her sternum. She did not answer. He did not press. He closed his kit, stood, and walked back into the bay. She paused in the telling. The dockworker under her hands had stabilized. His vitals were steady. The bleeding stopped. Relin had returned with a status update. The bombardment had paused. Orbital scans showed the Carthene fleet pulling back to regroup. They had hours, perhaps half a day. The Empress Dowager waited. She had not interrupted once during the telling, which was, for a woman who had ruled 3 systems, an act of extraordinary restraint. "You did not tell him," the old woman said. "Not then. Not for weeks. What changed?" Thesara wiped her hands on a cloth and sat on the edge of an empty cot. The medical tent smelled of antiseptic and the burned ozone residue that seeped in after bombardment strikes. A smell she had grown accustomed to the way one grows accustomed to any persistent truth, by ceasing to notice it. "There was a moment," she said. 3 weeks into her stay, the transit station had settled into the grim routine of extended crisis. Thesara had begun working not as the queen but as Thessa Valen, textile worker, false identity, broken arm healing under Corin's regular care. She sorted supplies in the depot. She helped in the meal distribution line. She repaired a scheduling conflict between the medical shift rotation and the meal distribution that had been causing a 30-minute gap in coverage during the evening transition. A gap she identified on her second day of work and resolved by adjusting the rotation intervals by 15 minutes. A change so minor that the station staff adopted it without noticing it had been made. She sat with the children in Bay 3 and told them stories. Old Valorian folk tales her mother had told her. about clever queens and patient warriors and the wisdom of small kindnesses. She was good at it. The children gathered in a half-circle, their dark violet eyes wide, and she discovered that the voice she had trained for throne room addresses worked just as well for fairy tales, and the structural discipline that made her policies coherent made her stories satisfying. Naya, the silent girl from Bay 3, began sitting closest, her paper bird clutched in both hands, her head tilted at the angle of a child who has decided that this particular adult is safe. One afternoon a boy from Bay 4, older, perhaps 8, with the closed expression of a child who has learned not to expect good things, interrupted a story to say that fairy tales were lies. Queens did not come to save anyone. Warriors did not protect the weak. The world was the transit station, cots, rations, waiting. Thessara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You are right that the world is sometimes a transit station, but the story is not about what the world is. It is about what the people inside it choose to do. The queen in the story does not save anyone by being a queen. She saves them by noticing they need saving. That is a choice anyone can make." The boy stared at her. Beside him, Corin, who had been restacking supply crates against the far wall, had gone still. She felt his attention the way she felt sunlight through a window, warm, directional, specific. The boy said nothing, but the next day he came back for the story, and the day after that. One evening, after the children had been settled for sleep, Corin found her in the supply depot, sorting protein ration blocks by expiration date. A task she had assigned herself because the existing system was inefficient and because she could not stop her hands from organizing things. "You sorted them by lot number and expiration," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "The previous system was alphabetical by manufacturer." "The previous system was wrong." "It was. I tried to change it 3 weeks ago. The depot manager told me the alphabetical system had been in place since the station opened." "The depot manager," Thessara said, "has been filing spoiled rations as consumed rather than wasted, which inflates his supply efficiency metrics and allows him to underreport shrinkage. The lot numbers on the third shelf do not match the intake manifests. The discrepancy is consistent across 14 entries." Corin went still. She felt the change, the subtle shift from casual conversation to the focused attention of a man who had just heard something that mattered. "How do you know that?" She met his gaze and realized she had just assessed a system the way a queen assesses systems, with the comprehensive, structural vision that comes from years of reading departmental reports and identifying where corruption grows. "Who are you?" he asked, quiet not hostile, his gray-green eyes steady. She set down the ration block. She looked at his hands, the calloused, scarred, working hands that had reset her splint and folded paper birds and held a dying man's vigil. Hands that belonged to someone who did not trade in favors or leverage or the currency of power. Hands that had simply shown up and done the work. "My name is not Thessavalin," she said. He waited. "My name is Thessara, Queen Thessara of the Valorian sovereignty, third of my line, sovereign of 31 billion people whose capital I failed to defend, and whose palace I escaped through a service tunnel while my guard died in a hangar fire." The silence that followed was not shock. It was not awe. It was the silence of a man reorganizing his understanding of another person, not discarding what he knew, but placing the new information alongside the existing observations and letting the picture resolve. "The broken arm," he said. "The shuttle hangar." "Yes." "The biometric seal on your wrist." She held up her arm. The cracked crystalline surface was visible under the compression wrap. "The false name, the avoidance of the medical tent, the sightlines." "Yes." He looked at her for a long time. In the supply depot's harsh overhead light, his face showed every line and scar the way a coastline shows the work of weather, openly, without apology. And then he said something Thessara would carry for the rest of her life, something that rearranged the architecture of her understanding of what it meant to be seen. "You have been here for 3 weeks," he said. "In that time you have sorted the supply depot, improved the ration distribution, identified a corruption scheme, comforted 17 children in Bay 3, and worked alongside refugees who do not know they are standing next to their own queen. You did all of this with a broken arm and a dead identity seal, without authority, without staff, without any of the machinery that your title provides. You did it because the work needed doing." He paused. "That is not what a queen does when she is in hiding. That is what a queen does when she cannot stop being one." The door inside her chest opened, and she let it. "You saw me," she said, "before you knew my name, before you knew my title, before any of it. You saw the person underneath, and you treated that person with the same attention you give everyone in this station, the child, the dying man, the broken water purifier. You did not see a queen hiding. You saw a woman working. And that, the fact that you saw the work and not the crown, is the most honest thing anyone has offered me in a decade." His expression did not change, not because he was unaffected, but because the effect was deep and quiet, the way a stone dropped into still water does not splash but simply sinks. His gray-green eyes held hers with the same patient attention he had given everything from the beginning. "What do you need?" he asked. 3 words. The simplest question a person can ask another person, and the one that Thessara, in 7 years on the throne, had heard least. Not "what do you command?" Not "what does the sovereignty require?" "What do you need?" "I need to go back. My people need their queen. The succession contingency is holding, but it was designed for months, not permanence. Vice-Chancellor Dorath is competent, but he is a caretaker, and the sovereignty needs more than caretaking right now. It needs the person who knows every tunnel in the palace." "Then we get you back." "It is not simple. My identity cannot be verified without the biometric seal. The sovereignty's intelligence apparatus will be looking for me, but through official channels. I am invisible to all of them. And the Carthene fleet controls the corridor between here and Valorian space. Then we find another corridor." She studied him. The depot was quiet. The overhead light hummed. Outside, the transit station conducted its nightly ritual of settling, cots creaking, sheets rustling, the murmur of 400 people negotiating the boundary between consciousness and the mercy of sleep. "The route through Carthene space requires a cargo-class vessel with humanitarian transit codes," she said. "The blockade permits medical and food shipments through 3 relay corridors, but the inspection protocols at each relay station are thorough enough to detect a passenger. They detect passengers traveling as passengers. They do not detect a grain shipment with accurate manifest documentation, and a pilot who knows the relay station chiefs by first name." He said it the way he said everything, plainly, without bravado, with the quiet confidence of a man who understood that relationships built over months of honest work were worth more than any forged credential. "You know the relay station chiefs. I have been running supply convoys through Carthene-controlled corridors for 9 months. I know the relay chiefs, the inspection officers, the dock mechanics, the cafeteria staff who pour the inspector's tea. I know which relay stations are strict about passenger manifests, and which ones care only that the cargo tonnage matches the documentation. I know the inspection windows, when the shifts change, when the senior officers take their meal breaks, when the junior officers are running the scans alone and are more interested in clearing the queue than interrogating a grain freighter. You mapped an escape route. I mapped a supply route. The escape part is new, but the infrastructure is the same." She studied him. "You are offering to help a queen you met 3 weeks ago return to a war zone through hostile territory. I am offering to help the woman who sorted my supply depot get where she needs to go. The queen part is your business." The corner of her mouth moved. The first time in weeks her face had attempted the expression. Why? Because you cannot stop being what you are, and the people who need what you are should not have to go without it because a shuttle hangar blew up. The Empress Dowager made a sound, low, percussive, the Valorian equivalent of a laugh that bypassed amusement and went directly to satisfaction. I like him. You have never met him, grandmother. I do not need to meet a man to like him. I need to hear how my granddaughter's voice changes when she says his name. Continue. Thesara's hands had found new work, checking the dockworkers' dressings, adjusting the IV line, the habitual motions of a woman who had learned field medicine in a refugee camp, because the camp needed medics more than it needed an uncrowned queen. She told the rest. The 3 weeks it took Corin to arrange passage, not through official channels, not through the transit authority that would have flagged her false identity, but through the network of supply convoy drivers and cargo haulers, he had built relationships with over months of aid work. Each one owed him nothing and gave him everything because he had earned their trust the same way he earned everything, by doing the work without asking for credit. She told about the route, not a military corridor, a humanitarian one. Grain shipments, medical supply chains, the invisible infrastructure of logistics that moved through war zones because food and medicine do not observe blockades. He had mapped it on a cargo manifest repurposed as a chart, his finger tracing paths between relay stations that no fleet commander would consider because they were too small, too slow, too unglamorous. But they were open, and they were his. She told about the nights in the supply depot after hours, reviewing the route together, the depot's overhead light casting hard shadows across the crates between them. She told about the conversation rhythms that developed, his questions precise, her answers comprehensive, two people discovering that their minds worked at the same speed, and in the same direction, the way two instruments tuned to the same frequency will resonate without being struck. She told about the evening he had brought her a paper bird, the same kind he had folded for Naya in Bay 3, and set it on the supply crate beside her elbow while she reviewed the route. She had looked at it and looked at him, and felt the full weight of what was growing between them settle into her chest like an anchor finding the sea floor. She told about the morning before departure, when she went to Bay 3 to say goodbye to the children. She did not tell them who she was. She told them one last story, about a queen who had been lost and found her way home because someone taught her that the road was not the destination, and the crown was not the queen, and the smallest kindness in the smallest room could carry more weight than every palace in the sovereignty. Naya had held up her paper bird and said, in a voice still thin with disuse, "Will you come back?" Thesara had knelt beside the child's cot, the same hanging sheet, the same warehouse bay, and said, "I will send someone who will make sure you are found." The paper man. Yes, the paper man will make sure. Naya had nodded, satisfied, and held the paper bird against her chest, and Thesara had stood and walked out of Bay 3, and felt the weight of every promise she had ever made as queen compress into the single promise she had just made to a 4-year-old girl holding a folded piece of paper. She told about the night before they left. Corin was loading the transport. She was checking the route one final time. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her, and his expression was the same steady, patient expression it had always been. But underneath it, in the set of his jaw, in the slight deepening of the lines around his eyes, something had shifted. "When we get you back," he said, "you will be the queen again. The palace, the council, the fleet, the decisions. You will not be the woman in the supply depot anymore, not to anyone who sees you. I know. I need you to know that I will always see her, the one who sorted the rations, the one who told stories to children in Bay 3. Regardless of what the room calls you, I will see her." Thesara looked at him, this human in a dusty jacket with engine grease under his nails, and a pocket full of paper, and the quiet, unshakable certainty of a man who had decided that seeing people was not a gift, but a discipline, practiced daily, without recognition, without reward. "That is why I need you to come with me," she said. The Empress Dowager was silent for a long moment. Outside the medical tent, the camp had settled into the tense stillness of a bombardment pause, people moving quickly, quietly, repairing what could be repaired, preparing for what came next. She could hear the shield generators charging. She could hear the distant hum of the orbital defense grid cycling through its diagnostic sequence. "He came," the old woman said. "He came. Through 4 Carthene patrol zones. Through a debris field that should have been impassable. Through a docking procedure at the Tessarine staging point that required him to talk his way past 3 security checkpoints using nothing but a cargo manifest, and the particular calm of a man who believes honesty is a navigational tool. He sat in the pilot's seat of a grain freighter and flew a route he had drawn on the back of a supply requisition. And when we crossed into sovereignty space and the first patrol cruiser challenged us, he transmitted our cargo identification and said, in a voice that did not waver, medical supplies and 1 passenger. Request docking clearance. And the passenger was the queen of the Velorian sovereignty. The passenger was a woman with a broken arm, a dead biometric seal, and a paper bird in her jacket pocket. The queen part came later. She paused. The memory of the journey was vivid in a way that surprised her, not the danger, which had been real but manageable, but the intimacy of a small ship's cockpit at night, with the nav console casting blue light across Corin's face while he flew and she navigated, and neither of them spoke for hours because the silence between them was not empty. It was full of the things they were choosing not to say because saying them would have forced a reckoning that the journey could not afford. At the second relay station, a Carthene inspection officer boarded the freighter and found her in the cargo bay. She was sitting on a grain crate, her splinted arm resting on her knee, the paper bird tucked in the breast pocket of the borrowed jacket. The inspector, a young Carthene male with the bored efficiency of someone performing the 87th scan of a 12-hour shift, looked at her, looked at the cargo manifest Corin had provided, and said, "Medical personnel." Before she could answer, Corin appeared at the cargo bay door. "Field medic," he said, "assigned to the Velorian refugee transit network. The paperwork is on page 3 of the manifest." The inspector flipped to page 3. There was nothing there that constituted actual medical credentials, only a supply transit authorization with a personnel rider that Corin had drafted himself, using terminology precise enough to satisfy a cursory review and vague enough to survive a detailed one. The inspector stamped the manifest and left. The freighter's engines engaged. The relay station fell behind them. Thessara looked at Corin, "Field medic. You set a broken splint, you treat a wound, you sit with a dying man. What else would you call it?" She did not have an answer for that. She was not certain she needed one. "The council," the Empress Dowager asked. "The Sovereignty's intelligence chief met us on the hangar deck." She looked at me dirty, thin, wearing a dead woman's jacket with a splint on my arm, and said, "Your Majesty, we have been searching for you for 37 days. And Corin, standing beside me with engine grease on his hands and a medical kit over his shoulder, said nothing. He stood there the way he stood everywhere, present, steady, taking up exactly the space he occupied and no more. The council wanted him removed, not a question. Debriefed, thanked, and sent back to the transit station. A human with no rank, no clearance, no diplomatic standing. He had smuggled the Queen through hostile territory in a cargo freighter, which was either treason or heroism, depending on which subsection of the Emergency Powers Act you cited. And you? I told the council that Corin Vale had saved their queen's life, rebuilt her will when it had broken, and navigated her through a war zone using nothing but cargo routes and decency. I told them any council that could not find room for that kind of man did not deserve the queen he had returned to them. They found room. Reluctantly, with conditions, 17 separate security reviews and a provisional status classification designed to make him feel temporary. He bore all of it without complaint. He bore the whispers, the Queen's human, without flinching. He bore the court's particular talent for making an outsider feel the precise dimensions of his outsiderhood. One evening, 3 months after their return, Thesara found him in the palace kitchen at 2300, eating a ration block, the same compact protein blocks they had eaten at the transit station. The palace kitchens offered full meals, prepared by staff, available to any authorized person. Corin was authorized. He simply did not use the service. He ate the same rations the refugees ate, at the same time, in the same solitary quiet, as though his body had not yet accepted that the transit station was behind him. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him eat, and she felt something she had never felt as queen, the particular ache of watching someone you care about endure a loneliness you have the power to end and the position to make worse. "You could eat with the staff," she said. "The staff are uncomfortable with my presence. I have been told, in the politest possible language, that my provisional status does not extend to communal dining with palace personnel." "Who told you that?" "The head of household services. She was very courteous about it." Thesara filed the name. The head of household services received a reassignment notice the following week, not a punishment, but a rotation to the outer administrative complex, where her particular talent for courteous exclusion would cause less damage. She paused. The medical tent was quiet. The dockworker was breathing steadily, his vitals holding. Relin was visible through the tent flap, moving between the triage stations outside with the focused efficiency of a young medic who had been taught to treat the next patient, not the last one. "He bore the worst of it during the formal audience sessions," Thesara continued. "He stood at the back of the chamber while I received petitioners and addressed the court. Provisional observer status. No seat. No speaking rights. He stood for 4 hours every session, his hands clasped behind his back, his face composed, while the sovereignty's noble houses filed their grievances and trade disputes and succession claims, and every one of them walked past him on the way to the dais without acknowledgement, as though he were a column, a piece of furniture, part of the architecture that held the room up but warranted no more attention than the stone. He stayed. For 2 years. He found work within the palace system, not the kind of work anyone assigned him, but the kind he assigned himself. He reorganized the palace's humanitarian supply chain, which had been operating at 60% efficiency, because no one with operational experience had examined it since before the war. He established a field medical training program for the palace guard, because the guards knew how to fight but not how to treat the wounded who appeared after the fighting stopped. He set up a communication relay with the refugee transit stations, including Kalo's IV, so that displaced families could locate their separated members. "Naya." Thesara's voice changed. The Empress Dowager heard the shift and leaned forward on her supply crate. "Corin found her family 4 months after we returned. Her mother had been evacuated on a different convoy, separated at the transit port, logged into a different processing system on a different station. Corin traced the file numbers across 3 refugee databases, identified the match, and arranged the reunification. And the child. When Naya saw her mother walk through the station entrance, she ran to her holding the paper bird in one hand and a second one in the other, a bird she had folded herself, taught by a human who had sat on a warehouse floor and given her the only thing she needed, a small shape with wings. And Corin. Corin watched the reunion from the corridor outside the processing center. He did not enter the room. He did not claim credit. He stood in the corridor and watched a mother hold her daughter, and then he walked back to the supply depot and began restacking crates, and that night he ate his meal alone in the palace kitchen, and no one in the sovereignty except me knew what he had done. The Empress Dowager made a sound that was not quite a word. Thesara recognized it, the sound her grandmother made when she encountered a quality she respected too much to name with the ordinary vocabulary of praise. And then the war demanded everything, Thesara said. The counteroffensive, the fleet coordination, the diplomatic negotiations with the Kalosian Compact, the reconstruction budgets, the casualty reports. Every name, grandmother, I read every name, the way you taught me. A sovereign carries her dead. I taught you that. I am beginning to wonder if I was wrong. You were not wrong. But carrying the dead is heavy, and I was carrying it alone, and the one person who saw me, the real me, the one beneath the title, I sent him away. The Empress Dowager's amber eyes sharpened. Explain. 2 years after our return, the council presented a diplomatic marriage proposal, House Catherine, the Kalosian border territories, a political alliance that would have secured the northern corridor and brought 3 Kalosian fleet groups into the sovereignty's defense perimeter. The strategic value was undeniable. And Corin was in the room. Provisional status, observer. He sat at the far end of the table and listened to my war minister describe the strategic necessity of marrying a man I had never met, and his face did not change. Not one line, not one flicker. He gave me the same steady gaze he always gave me, and when the session ended and the council filed out, he was the last to leave, and at the door he turned and said, "You should take it. The northern corridor is worth more than." Worth more than what? He did not finish the sentence. He left the room. The next morning, I found his provisional clearance badge on my desk with a single line on a piece of paper. The supply depot is always open. The Empress Dowager said nothing for 10 seconds. Then, with the devastating precision of a woman who had spent 60 years parsing the things people said and the things they meant, he left so you would not have to choose. Yes. And you let him. Yes. Because duty. Because duty. And in 9 years since, you have rejected every marriage proposal your council has brought, every diplomatic alliance, every strategic match. You told them the sovereignty's interests are best served by an unmarried sovereign who cannot be leveraged through a consort's political obligations. And they believed you because it was true. The strategic argument is sound. The strategic argument is a fortress you built around the fact that you are in love with a man who folds paper birds, and you are too proud and too frightened to go find him. The words landed in the medical tent like ordnance. Thesara looked at her grandmother, this fierce, diminished, impossible old woman wrapped in a thermal blanket on a supply crate during a bombardment, and felt the last of her defenses give way. "I know where he is," she said quietly. "He went back to aid work, transit stations, refugee processing, wherever the need is. I receive reports through channels my intelligence chief maintains without being asked, because even she understood that some information is not strategic, it is personal. And he is well. He has spent 7 years doing what he does. He is older, grayer. The reports say he still folds paper for the children." The Empress Dowager pushed herself off the supply crate. She stood slowly, her joints protesting, and she crossed the tent to where Thesara sat. She placed one thin, weathered hand on her granddaughter's cheek, a gesture she had not made since Thesara was a child, and said, with the authority of a woman who had earned the right to issue commands that transcended rank, "Find him." Thesara covered her grandmother's hand with her own. The war will be managed by your vice-chancellor, your fleet admiral, and the 900,000 personnel who serve the sovereignty's military apparatus. You built the machine. Let it run. Go find the man who saw you when you had no crown and loved what he saw. It has been 7 years, grandmother. He may not. He left his badge on your desk with a note that said the supply depot is always open. That is not a goodbye. That is a door left unlocked by a man who is too decent to walk through it himself. Walk through it. The tent was quiet, the shield generators hummed, the camp held its breath. And Thessara, queen of the Valorian sovereignty, sovereign of 31 billion people, architect of a government that could survive her absence because she had designed it that way, looked at her grandmother and felt the full weight of 9 years of duty and 7 years of silence resolve into a single, clear, unbearable truth. She wanted him, not the strategic alliance, not the northern corridor, not the diplomatic marriage. She wanted the man who had knelt beside a frightened child and made something with wings out of a piece of paper. She wanted the hands that had reset her splint and the eyes that had seen through her false name and the voice that had said, "I will always see her." The duty was real. It would always be real. But the desire, the specific, irreducible wanting of this one person was real too, and she had spent 9 years calling it something else, and the something else had worn through. "I will find him," she said. The Empress Dowager nodded. Once. The way a sovereign nods when something has been decided at a depth that requires no further discussion. Then she returned to her supply crate, settled into her thermal blanket and said, "Good. Now finish telling me about the paper bird." Thessara almost laughed. The sound caught in her throat and became something warmer, not quite joy, not quite grief, but the thing that lives where the two overlap. She told her grandmother about the paper bird, the particular way Corin had folded its wings, the way it had sat on the supply crate catching the depot's harsh light, and casting a shadow shaped like something that could fly. Outside the tent, the camp's recovery operations continued. Medics moved between the triage stations. Engineers shored up blast-damaged shelters. Somewhere in the communications hub, the orbital defense grid's diagnostic cycle completed and began again. The machinery of survival ground forward the way it always did, one task, one person, one small act of competence at a time. Thessara finished her shift. She sterilized her instruments. She updated the triage logs with the careful attention of a woman who believed that every name in a record mattered, because every name was a person, and every person deserved to be counted accurately. She walked through the camp in the blue-gray light of the planet's dusk, past the water reclamation tanks and the communications array, and the children's shelter, where a volunteer was telling a story to a semicircle of small faces. And she thought about supply depots and paper birds, and the particular weight of a man's attention when it sees the person instead of the title. She returned to her quarters, a partitioned corner of a prefabricated shelter, smaller than the closets in her palace, furnished with a cot and a field desk, and a single personal item she had carried through every relocation since the war's first year. A paper bird, folded from a page of cargo manifest, wings creased sharp, tail pinched into a fan. Set on her desk 9 years ago by a man with calloused hands who understood that small things, made with attention, carry more weight than grand gestures. She picked it up. The paper was soft with age, the fold lines worn to the texture of cloth. She held it in her palm and felt its weight, almost nothing, almost everything, and she made her decision the way she made all her real decisions. Not with calculation, not with strategy, not with the structural analysis she brought to policy and governance, but with the part of herself that Corin had seen first and had never stopped seeing. The woman, not the queen. The woman who had sorted rations with a broken arm and told fairy tales to frightened children and fallen in love with a man whose hands folded paper into the shape of flight. She set the bird back on her desk. She opened a secure channel to her intelligence chief. She said 4 words. "Find me Corin Vale." And the door that had been locked for 9 years, the one she had braced with duty and strategy and the weight of 31 billion names, opened. Not with force, not with a grand gesture. With the quiet, irreversible certainty of a woman who had finally stopped confusing what the sovereignty needed with what she was afraid to need herself. and discovered that the answer had been sitting in a supply depot somewhere in the transit network, folding paper, keeping a door unlocked for a queen who had only ever needed to walk through it. The supply depot was always open. She had only needed to stop being afraid to enter it.